One of the things that the algorithm here does differently than other algorithms on other platforms is weighting of specificity of interest. And TikTok tends to have a interest magnifying impact. What this means is that the hashtags that you interact with or brand your own content with tend to have a bigger impact the more specific they are. And when stuff aligns particularly well, like highly well-trafficked tags that you interact with regularly, that tends to have a big impact on what you see. Obviously, neurodivergence and philosophy, kind of my main bags. But I've also got, like nerdy interests as well that I like to engage with. And that informs what my feed looks like. Now, in the course of the deliberations over the last couple of years, a number of Congress people and recently a number of judges asked the question, but can't these geniuses and these other companies come up with something that does the same thing? Yes, of course they can. They don't want to. The people over at Facebook have no trouble getting that information from your browsing patterns. Quite the contrary, they are, if anything, far more efficient at interpreting micro-habit and extrapolating that into actionable data points. They have absolutely no trouble figuring out what it is that we want and what we want to be interacting with and who we want to be interacting with. That's just not their agenda. There's an adage that's gotten a fair bit of traffic over the last decade and a half. If you are not paying for a service, you are not the consumer, you are the product. And nowhere is that more evident than in how the big data companies use that big data and the description of you that they extrapolate from it. Oh, and while we're at it, just in case anyone is still buying the line that current AI tech is actually current tech, Llama is basically a reskin of the algorithmic model that Facebook was using in order to extrapolate our ad targeting from those data points as early as 2010. We'll get to the engineered tech slowdown in another video. While we're talking about extrapolating actionable information from this harvested metadata, there is that little thing about how Google was using extrapolated maps data in order to provide targeting telemetry for US drone strikes. Because it's a lot easier to aim this stuff if you have a mathematically reliable model of where people are going to be. Really wish I was making this up, but it actually happened. Most of their brightest and best quit over this. Which also highlights, by the way, virtually anyone who has even a shred of conscience and enough insight into the core operations of this technology jumped ship a long time ago. So what does Facebook do with it? Well, they're not targeting drone strikes, but there was a rather famous case where over the course of 2 weeks, they targeted about 700,000 of their users to see to what degree they could induce depression. The answer to that was funerals and settling out of court. Now, is that their primary business model? By no means. Well, not exactly. If TikTok's primary engagement model and algorithmic target is to get you engaged with stuff that you like for the longest amount of time so that you are exposed to monetized traffic and are more likely to be an economic participant in the platform, and let's be honest, that's a relatively simple thing to describe mathematically. Meta is aiming for a much more difficult target. Depressed enough, responsive to stimuli enough, and engaged with the process of utilizing the platform enough that you, through the process of scrolling, are forming unconscious neurochemical associations between the stimuli that they provide and the little hits of dopamine that you receive along the way. Why else would they be engaging with large-scale induction of depression if they were not also in the business of providing some alleviation for that depression in the form of sensory stimuli and brand association with the release of dopamine when interacting with the sensory stimuli associated with that brand? That is the essence of their advertising model, at least in theory. Before virtual reality Mark Nokia became a real boy and grew a set of legs, they were pumping billions of dead-end research capital into trying to create an environment in which they have total control over the sense experiences that you were interacting with while you were engaged with it, while simultaneously proposing that this would be the ultimate, dare I say, final solution to commercial capital engagement for the consumer. The metaverse was supposed to be, and it was marketed as, Amazon directly wired into your brain for all intents and purposes, with direct access, giving advertisers and marketers direct access to the pleasure centers of your brain. No, they did not pull it off. Unsurprisingly, the guy who was trying to sell us a total immersive VR experience that looked like a bad patch of the first generation EverQuest private server doesn't actually understand the technology involved all that well. But it's the intent that matters here. So, could Meta code something with an algorithmic level of engagement comparable to TikTok? Of course they could. But then they would have a product that actually gives us what we want, instead of engineering just enough misery that we're reaching for our wallets, but not so much misery that we unplug.